Welcome to Bedtime Finance Stories. Tonight's episode is titled Calm Secrets from the Great Depression, Finance for Sleep. In the quiet hours of history, there was a time when the world slowed under the weight of uncertainty. The Great Depression was not only an economic storm, but a season of silence where trust was shaken and simple habits became anchors of survival. Families gathered around dim lamps, stretching meals, saving coins, and finding strength in each other's presence. This story is not told in haste, but in a gentle rhythm, like footsteps across an empty street at dusk. It is a reminder that even in times of scarcity, wisdom is born. That resilience, patience, and frugality can carry us farther than wealth alone. So, let your thoughts drift and allow the calm lessons of the past to soothe you tonight. Now, let us begin. Calm Secrets from the Great Depression. Finance for Sleep. Calm Secrets from the Great Depression, the Quiet Fall. The story of the Great Depression does not begin with chaos, but with a quiet rise. In the years before 1929, the American landscape was filled with optimism. Cities pulsed with energy, automobiles hummed down expanding roads, and radios carried music into every living room. The stock market had become not just a place for professionals, but a promise whispered into ordinary households. Teachers, farmers, small shop owners, all found themselves drawn toward this shining symbol of prosperity. The prices of shares climbed steadily, and people began to borrow money simply to invest. The air was full of dreams, but those dreams were delicate, like soap bubbles drifting against a summer sky. Beneath the brightness, there was imbalance. Too much debt, too much speculation, too little foundation. When October of 1929 arrived, it came not with thunder, but with the soft scratching of pens, the clicking of telegraphs, the murmurs of doubt. The stock market crashed, and suddenly, paper wealth dissolved. Fortunes shrank overnight, and families who had believed themselves secure felt the ground shift beneath them. There was panic, yes, but also silence. Men in suits stared blankly at ticker tapes. Mothers folded their aprons, unsure how to stretch what little they had left. The quiet fall was not only about money. It was about trust breaking apart, and in this silence, one could already sense a secret. That wealth built only on hope, without grounding in reality, is fragile. Reflection. Sometimes, the greatest collapse begins with the quiet unraveling of trust, and the reminder that balance matters more than unchecked hope. Shadows in the banks. As the market fell, banks became fragile towers trembling under the weight of fear. In towns both large and small, whispers spread that banks might not return the money entrusted to them. And so, people lined up outside their doors. They came with coats buttoned tight, clutching small deposit books, asking for the return of their savings. But the banks did not have all the money they promised. Loans had been given, risks had been taken, and when too many hands reached at once, the vaults ran dry. Across the nation, thousands of banks closed. Imagine the quiet inside a shuttered bank lobby, once filled with voices. The chairs empty, the counters abandoned, the air holding the weight of disappointment. For many, life savings vanished. Entire lifetimes of careful effort slipped away. Yet from this darkness, a lesson emerged. People began to hide money beneath mattresses, in jars buried in gardens, in envelopes tucked inside books. Trust was no longer in institutions, it retreated into the home. The sound of coins in a tin became more comforting than the promise of interest from a banker's smile. The shadows in the banks revealed a truth, that money, though made of numbers and ledgers, was truly about confidence. Without confidence, even a mighty system could fall. Reflection. The silence of closed banks teaches us that finance rests not only on numbers, but on faith, and when that faith is broken, people seek safety in the simplest of places. the dust of the land. The Great Depression was not only about markets and money, it was about the land itself. In the heart of America, the soil grew tired. Farmers, driven by the hunger for production, had plowed too deeply, too often. When the rains failed and winds rose, the earth turned against them. Dust storms swept across the plains, blotting out the sun, coating homes in fine, choking layers. Families sat at wooden tables, watching as their crops withered and their animals weakened. The fields no longer gave life, and with no harvest, debts mounted. Farmers left their homes behind, carrying what they could on trucks or wagons, seeking new beginnings in distant states. The Dust Bowl became a symbol of fragility, of how human ambition, when disconnected from patience and care, can wound the very ground that sustains us. It was a slow reminder that wealth does not only live in banks or markets, but in the soil, the rain, the air we breathe. And yet, within these dusty struggles, communities found ways to endure. Neighbors shared bread. Families sang by lamplight to soothe the silence of empty cupboards. The dust may have darkened the skies, but it also revealed the quiet strength of resilience. Reflection. Even in storms of dust, the human spirit learns that true wealth is not only in what we grow, but in how we endure together. The new promises. In the midst of despair, leadership shifted. The government, once distant from daily financial struggles, stepped closer. President Franklin D. Roosevelt spoke calmly to the people through radio broadcasts. Fireside chats, they were called. His voice, steady and measured, reached millions of ears. He spoke of new beginnings, of efforts to restore trust, of programs to rebuild both banks and lives. The New Deal emerged, not as a sudden cure, but as a collection of small, steady steps. Jobs were created to build roads, bridges, and parks. Artists painted murals. Writers recorded local histories. Musicians played in public squares. It was a reminder that labor, even when simple, could bring dignity and rhythm back to life. The Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, was born, offering protection for savings accounts. Slowly, people dared once again to place money in banks. The fragile trust began to mend. In these new promises, one could see a pattern. Healing was not about grand miracles, but about restoring the ordinary. A paycheck in the hands of a worker, food on the table of a family, coins safely waiting in a bank. These were the quiet victories of the time. Reflection. Renewal comes not in sudden bursts, but in the patient building of small securities, each one a promise kept. Frugality and the everyday beyond policies and speeches. The true fabric of the Great Depression was woven in kitchens, workshops, and backyards. Families learned to live with less. Dresses were patched, shoes repaired, meals stretched. What once seemed like deprivation slowly became a rhythm of survival. Children learned to play with homemade toys. Gardens sprang up behind houses, each seed carrying not just hope for food, but for independence. Neighbors shared recipes for soups that could feed many with little. A culture of frugality emerged, and with it, a quiet wisdom. That wealth is not always about what we possess, but how resourcefully we use it. In this way, the Depression revealed a secret resilience hidden in ordinary habits. People discovered that the act of saving, mending, and reusing was not only necessary, but grounding. It gave rhythm to days that otherwise felt uncertain. And even as the nation's economy remained heavy with struggle, there was a soft strength in the simple act of enduring, one day at a time. Reflection. In the stillness of hard times, the smallest acts of frugality become quiet treasures of survival and wisdom. The slow dawn. By the late 1930s, the long night of the Great Depression began to lift. Recovery was uneven, but slowly, markets stabilized, jobs increased, and confidence grew. The lessons, however, remained etched into memory. Those who had lived through the scarcity carried new habits for the rest of their lives. They saved carefully, avoided unnecessary debts, and valued simple securities. A jar of coins on a shelf, a pantry stocked with preserved foods, a habit of reusing, these became symbols of quiet comfort. The Great Depression was a wound, but it also became a teacher. It showed that financial systems can falter, that wealth can vanish, and yet human endurance remains. It whispered that prosperity without caution is fragile, but scarcity with resilience can still bring dignity. As dawn returned, it was not marked by sudden celebration, but by the quiet relief of households that had survived. The secrets of the Great Depression were not loud declarations, but calm reminders. Balance, trust, frugality, and the strength of community. Reflection. From the stillness of the Great Depression, the calmest secrets remain. Prosperity is fleeting, but wisdom endures. Memories carried forward. As the years passed, the Great Depression became less of a present struggle and more of a memory that lived in the hearts of those who endured it. By the 1940s, new challenges emerged: war, rebuilding, shifting economies, but the lessons of the Depression never truly faded. They became quiet companions, shaping how people approached money, risk, and security. In households across America, parents told their children stories not of riches gained, but of hard times survived. A mother would remind her daughter to save scraps of fabric because she remembered when a single patch could make the difference between worn-out clothes and something wearable for school. A father would tell his son to keep a portion of every paycheck because he remembered the sting of watching banks collapse and wages disappear. These small reminders were passed down not as burdens, but as wisdom wrapped in lived experience. The memories were not always spoken. Sometimes they lingered in gestures, the way an older neighbor carefully folded paper bags to reuse them, or the way grandparents stored jars of food in cool cellars, always prepared for a future of uncertainty. It was as though the memory of scarcity had become a rhythm, an invisible music guiding everyday choices. For those who had known the Great Depression, prosperity was never taken for granted again. A stocked pantry was not just food, it was peace of mind. A small savings account was not just money, it was a shield against fear. Even as the economy grew stronger and opportunities expanded, the shadow of the Depression whispered a reminder: nothing is promised, and every effort to prepare is a quiet form of security. In schools, history books spoke of the crash of 1929 and the long years that followed. But for many, the truer lessons came not from pages, but from lived memory. The Depression had taught that markets rise and fall, but communities endure, that trust is delicate, but resilience is steady, that even in times of despair, the smallest acts of care, sharing bread, planting a seed, saving a coin, could carry families forward. As new generations grew, they may not have felt the hunger, the dust, or the long lines at shuttered banks. Yet they inherited the calm wisdom of those who had lived through it. They inherited the understanding that finance was not only about wealth, but about patience, discipline, and the quiet comfort of being prepared for storms. The memories of the Great Depression lived on like an echo, soft but steady. Not a shout from the past, but a calm whisper guiding those who listened. Reflection. The memories of hardship, carried gently forward, remind us that wisdom is not only in what we gain, but in what we never forget. The culture of saving. After the Great Depression, a subtle culture of saving emerged that stretched across decades. It was not loud or celebrated. It was quiet and practical. In living rooms, glass jars collected coins that would one day be used for small but important needs. In kitchens, coffee tins stored dollar bills, folded carefully and set aside. Saving was no longer just a practice of bankers and businessmen. It became an everyday ritual, like lighting a lamp or mending a shirt. Children grew up watching their parents treat money with caution. A penny was not discarded. It was placed carefully into a box. Purchases were delayed, and questions like, "Do we truly need this?" became part of the household vocabulary. What had once been normal, spending freely, trusting credit, assuming tomorrow would provide, was replaced by restraint. The Depression had taught that money was fragile, and so saving was more than an act of preparation. It was an act of self-protection. Each coin saved carried with it a sense of calm, a promise that if the future grew uncertain, there would be something to hold on to. Communities, too, developed rhythms of thrift. Churches organized collective savings plans. Small neighborhood lending circles emerged, where trust was not given to distant banks, but kept close among familiar faces. People remembered how institutions had failed them once, and so they built quiet systems of their own, relying on each other as much as on paper currency. This culture of saving created a generation that valued simplicity. They did not always reach for luxury. They reached for security. They learned that true comfort was not in extravagant possessions, but in the knowledge that they could weather storms. Reflection. Saving became not just about money, but about peace. The calm assurance that tomorrow, though uncertain, could still be faced with quiet strength. Quiet work and steady hands. Alongside saving, another lesson of the Depression was the dignity of quiet work. During those difficult years, millions had been unemployed, lining up in search of jobs that did not exist. The memory of that emptiness shaped how people valued employment in the decades after. When a man had a steady job, no matter how modest, he carried it with pride. A factory worker, a teacher, a clerk, all understood that work was not just wages, but security, rhythm, and meaning. The paycheck, however small, was more than numbers on paper. It was a lifeline. This perspective fostered patience. Promotions were not demanded quickly. Careers unfolded slowly, with loyalty and persistence. The simple act of showing up day after day became a source of pride. Families valued stability over sudden leaps. Even when new industries grew and new opportunities appeared, there was always the memory of what it felt like when jobs had disappeared overnight. Workplaces became more than economic engines. They were communities of endurance. Men and women carried their lunches in simple tins, shared conversations during breaks, and returned home with weary but grateful hands. The culture of quiet work reminded them that financial life was not always about ambition. It was about endurance. In this way, the Depression left behind a legacy of gratitude. To hold a job, to earn wages, to place food on the table. These were no longer small things. They were daily triumphs, quiet victories that spoke to the resilience of ordinary life. Reflection. Work, when carried with patience and gratitude, is not only about wages, it is about the quiet dignity of endurance. The secret of community. Perhaps the calmest secret of the Great Depression was not found in banks, savings, or jobs, but in people. When times grew hardest, survival often depended on the strength of community. Neighbors looked after each other, sharing meals, tools, and knowledge. A loaf of bread was stretched across families. A borrowed blanket warmed more than one household. During the Depression, countless families learned that isolation made hardship heavier, but solidarity made it lighter. Churches became gathering points, not only for worship, but for support. Community halls were filled with shared meals and songs. Even when wallets were empty, people discovered that kindness, generosity, and companionship could fill the emptiness. This secret endured long after the Depression ended. It became part of the American fabric, passed down through stories of shared hardship. Grandparents reminded grandchildren that survival was not an individual achievement, but a collective effort. The Depression had stripped away illusions of independence, revealing that beneath all financial systems, the greatest wealth was found in one another. A neighbor's helping hand, a friend's small loan, a community's shared labor. These formed a currency more lasting than paper bills. And in the years after, even as prosperity returned, the memory lingered. Communities remembered that bonds formed in hardship were bonds that could not easily be broken. Reflection. The calmest secret of all is that wealth lies not only in money, but in the quiet strength of community, where shared burdens become lighter and survival becomes possible. Lessons etched in habits. As the Great Depression moved further into the past, its influence did not vanish. It was etched into the smallest of daily habits. Families who had endured scarcity carried with them quiet practices that later generations sometimes found curious. A grandmother might carefully wash and fold sheets of aluminum foil, storing them neatly for reuse. A grandfather might keep a drawer filled with bits of string, rubber bands, and nails, each saved with the thought that one day it might prove useful. These habits were not born from thrift alone. They were born from memory. They whispered of a time when every object held value, when nothing could be wasted, because everything mattered. Children growing up in the 1950s and 1960s sometimes found these practices puzzling, even unnecessary in times of prosperity. But behind the quiet persistence of such routines was an unspoken lesson. Wealth is fragile, and preparedness is wisdom. These habits formed an invisible inheritance. Even when the Depression generation passed away, their stories and actions lived on. They taught that money should not be the sole measure of security, that the discipline of restraint and reuse carried a deeper meaning than convenience. The smallest acts of care, saving, repairing, reusing, were not trivial, but a reminder that resilience is built one quiet habit at a time. Reflection. Habits shaped by hardship remind us that strength is not always in what we gain, but in the discipline of what we preserve. The balance of fear and hope. The Depression left a paradox in the hearts of those who lived through it. On one hand, there was a lasting fear that wealth could vanish overnight, that markets could crumble, that security was never certain. On the other hand, there was also hope that even in the darkest years, people endured, adapted, and built new beginnings. This balance of fear and hope became a subtle compass for the generations that followed. Some grew cautious, avoiding debt at all costs, holding tightly to every dollar. Others, remembering how life continued even in ruin, pursued dreams with quiet courage, trusting that resilience would carry them through. The legacy of the Depression was not uniform. It lived differently in each person. But together, it created a culture more aware of risk, more respectful of stability, and more humbled by the fragile nature of prosperity. In many ways, this balance shaped the financial system itself. Laws were written to guard against collapse, protections created to restore trust, and institutions built with the memory of failure still fresh. Yet the truest balance remained in the hearts of ordinary people, the balance of living cautiously while still daring to hope. The calm secret within this paradox was clear. Neither fear nor hope alone can guide us. It is the steady rhythm of both, guarding against excess, yet trusting in renewal, that creates lasting resilience. Reflection. True wisdom lies in the balance of fear and hope, where caution steadies us and hope carries us forward. The echo, across time. Though nearly a century has passed since the Great Depression, its echo still lingers. Modern generations may not stand in bread lines or watch banks close their doors, but the lessons live quietly in their world. Every time a person saves a portion of their income, every time a government steps in to stabilize an economy, every time families gather around simple meals during hard times, the memory of the Depression breathes again. It is not always recognized as history. Sometimes it is felt only as intuition, the sense that one should prepare for storms, that one should not trust growth without foundation, that endurance matters more than extravagance. These echoes shape choices in ways both small and large, rippling across time like gentle waves that never fully fade. The Depression's calmest secret may be this, that even the greatest hardships leave behind not only scars, but wisdom. The memories of scarcity created a culture of endurance, and those lessons, once carved into daily life, continue to whisper to each new generation. And so, as people of the present lie down to rest, the echoes of that distant past still lull them toward caution, simplicity, and resilience. The Great Depression was not just an economic event. It was a teacher, its voice still soft but steady, guiding lives long after its storms ended. Reflection. The echo of hardship reminds us that even when the past feels distant, its wisdom still flows quietly into the choices of today. The quiet gift of resilience. As the Great Depression faded into history, what remained was not only the memory of hardship, but the quiet gift of resilience. Those who lived through those years did not think of themselves as heroes. They were simply people who endured, step by step, day by day, finding ways to stretch a meal, mend a coat, or share a little kindness. Resilience was not always loud. It was found in the steady hands of a worker showing up each morning despite uncertainty. It was in the patience of a mother who made soup from scraps and called it dinner with dignity. It was in the neighbor who offered tools, advice, or comfort without asking for repayment. These small acts, almost invisible, became the threads that held entire communities together. The quiet gift of resilience was passed forward. Children who watched their parents endure grew into adults who carried that endurance within themselves. They learned that hardship could break comfort, but not spirit, that wealth could vanish, but dignity could remain, and that survival was not always about strength, but about patience and care. Even in times of later prosperity, the echoes of this resilience could be felt. Families continued to value security, to respect frugality, to treat money as something fragile rather than guaranteed. Nations built systems of safety, not because they believed they could avoid hardship forever, but because they remembered how deeply hardship had once shaped them. In the end, the Depression gave a gift no one had asked for, but everyone carried, the knowledge that even in the hardest winters, the human spirit bends but does not break. Reflection. The calmest gift of all is resilience, the quiet strength that endures, even when everything else falls away. A whisper for the present. The story of the Great Depression is not only history, it is a whisper that still reaches us today. Though the years have passed and the world has changed, the calm secrets it left behind remain. That trust must be guarded, that savings bring peace, that community is wealth, and that resilience is the quiet foundation of survival. As you rest tonight, think of those who once sat in silence, listening to radios in dimly lit rooms, wondering how they would face tomorrow. Think of the families who found strength in sharing, the workers who endured long days, the children who learned to treasure even the smallest comforts. Their story is not so different from our own. For every generation faces uncertainty. Markets rise and fall, challenges appear and fade. But the calm secrets carried from the past remind us that we are never without tools. Caution, hope, endurance, and community. These are not just relics of history, but living guides. And so, as the echoes of the Depression drift into memory, let them become a gentle lullaby. They do not warn us with fear, but soothe us with wisdom. For the past does not vanish. It rests quietly within us, reminding us to live with balance, gratitude, and care. Reflection. The Great Depression ends as a story, but continues as a whisper, guiding us to hold steady, to live simply, and to trust that resilience will always carry us forward.